Multiple sclerosis is one of the most prevalent and puzzling diseases on the planet. As you'll learn, just getting an accurate estimate on the number of cases can be an exercise in futility. At the forefront of the movement to respond to the many questions MS patients ask is Elaine Dulac. In addition to being an MS patient, she's a registered nurse, frequent talk show guest, researcher, and author of the book They Said It Didn't Make Sense, MS, The Prokaren Story. If you've not yet read this book, pick up a copy and read it today. And stay with us as we meet Elaine Dulac and ask her what it's like to get to the truths behind what's really being done to treat and find a cure for MS, and about what's not being done and why. We'll go behind the headlines of the day and discover what motivates the drug companies, and learn how treatments are developed, approved, and marketed. We'll even look at the National MS Society and see where their funding comes from and where it goes. Spend the next hour or so with us as we ask the questions and reveal the surprising answers behind the myths of MS. This is Elaine Dulac. Elaine, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mike.
So you're an author now. You've written your first book about your journey, as it were, from finding out that you had multiple sclerosis to taking it on yourself to find out what it was, and then even researching a treatment for it that works for people. So let's go back to the very beginning when you first found out that you had MS. What was your experience?
My first symptoms were when I was pregnant with my son back in 1984. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, I couldn't feel my left leg. I couldn't feel it, I couldn't move it. Wait about 20 minutes and then work again. And they thought, well, it's the way the baby was sitting. But after my son was born, the symptoms continued, and they started to happen during the day. And I'd become numb all the way up to the knee, and then pretty soon it was into my left hand, and my left leg was weak, and pretty soon I had some speech problems, and I had some vision problems, and they'd come and they'd go. And eventually, after several years of seeing doctors, etc., and a lot of prodding and, pricking and stuff, they realized that I had, they came to the conclusion that I had multiple sclerosis. And that was in 1988 I was finally diagnosed.
What did the doctor say to do?
Well, first off, when I went to the doctor and they got this diagnosis, they sent me to an MRI, and I had these two little lesions in my neck. And so then, I asked them to have it redone, and that confirmed the same two little lesions were there. And so then, I had the visually evoked response, and that was normal, and I had the spinal tap, and that was normal. And after doing all those tests, they still came back and said, well, none of those tests are really conclusive, so it still comes back to the, your clinical symptoms. And based on your clinical symptoms, you have MS. And they had nothing to offer me. They said, eat well, get your sleep. And I already knew that's what I needed to do in order to even begin to function. But I had always been a very active person. Now, a lot of people will say, well, one of the reasons MS may be, hard to diagnose, etc., is because they'll say it affects everybody differently. I don't find that to be. If you talk to MS patients, they'll tell you there are classic symptoms of MS.
Myth. There are no typical symptoms for MS.
First off, MS patients cannot tolerate heat. Absolutely can't tolerate it. It just shuts us down. Even a half a degree. We can't take a warm shower. We can't take a warm bath. In fact, before I even had my diagnosis of MS, I'd gotten into a hot tub with my husband. And just in the minute it took him to sit down on the seating bench next to me, I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. He thought I'd quit breathing. He had to pull me out, got cooled off, and I was perfectly normal again. That's how they used to diagnose people with MS. They used to just put them in a hot tub of water, and if they made their symptoms worse, they had a diagnosis of MS. I still think it's one of the best diagnostic tools we have. People with MS cannot tolerate heat. And later on, I'll explain why that is for my research. Another classic symptom of MS is fatigue, horrendous fatigue. You feel like your body is encased in cement. I mean, your arms are so heavy you can hardly lift them. I used to have these recurring dreams, and this is how kind of my body would be relating to it, is that I was literally falling through the floor, sinking through the floor. I was so heavy. I used to always be a very ambitious person. In fact, those are the type of people that usually get MS. I'm a very outgoing, type A personality, go, 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 overachiever. And all of a sudden, I was lucky if I could make the bed and dinner in the same day. I mean, is that horrendous a fatigue? Also, cognition is a problem. You know, I used to have trouble reading. I'd have to get all other possible stimuli out of the room, shut everything so it was just, I could concentrate. And I may have to read a paragraph 3 times to make it make sense. Otherwise, it was just words. Very, very typical. Those are very, very typical symptoms of MS. Now, granted, yeah, a person may have left-sided weakness versus another person has right-sided weakness. Or a person, most people, MS patients end up with usually some problems with their bladder, and usually it's a frequency and they have trouble urinating. That's very common too. They usually have gastric problems and those things. So, but whether it's your right side or your left side, etc., those are really the only variances. For the most part, they're very, very classic symptoms.
So unlike the way many of us would react when they were faced with a prognosis of a life with this disease, your curiosity made you research and find out what was going on. Is that kind
I don't
of
even know if it was curiosity. It was called survival. You know, after I got, you know, they made me go through this whole barrage of testing, you know, the MRI, the spinal tap, the visual evoked response, all these things. And when it all came down to it, it was just the diagnosis was really on my symptoms. And so they seemed so adamant that they had to get this diagnosis of MS. After I got the diagnosis, like, well, okay, this is your diagnosis. We don't have anything to offer you. Go home, get your sleep, eat well. And, you know, at first I had my pity party and my, you know, and poor me. And actually it was a relief to get that diagnosis because your symptoms can wax and wane so much within even hour to hour that a lot of doctors thought, hey, you're nuts. You're a hypochondriac. Well, I was never one to run to the doctor, you know, or it's stress. Or, well, yeah, stress seems to bother me, but how come? How come I can't seem to handle it all of a sudden? I used to be able to handle it just fine. Mm-hmm. And so your mind starts thinking, do I have a brain tumor? Do I have this? What's wrong with me? Maybe I am going nuts type thing. So it was almost kind of a relief to get a diagnosis finally. And then, you know, so you have the typical pity party, oh, woe is me, see, I told you I was sick. And then I was like, no, you know, I'll beat this thing. And so I tried to fight it first with denial. Well, denial didn't work very well. You know, I continued to get worse. In fact, one day I was walking, carrying my son, and I went to step down on the deck, you know, on the step, and my left leg just gave way. And he toppled forward, we both toppled forward, he hit his head, and had to have stitches. And at that point I realized, you know, I've got some problems. Well, interestingly, there was a lady that called me shortly after I had been diagnosed with MS. And to this day, I don't know her name. And she contacted me and she said, you need to contact Dr. Raymond Bjork. He was in my hometown of Helena, Montana. He had MS himself and had been experimenting on himself. Now, I called the doctor. I never got to talk to the doctor. I talked with his wife. She said he wasn't seeing patients anymore. A few days later, I get this prescription in the mail of adenosine monophosphate and vitamin B12 injections. Now, I wasn't a nurse at the time. I didn't want to do the injections. So I decided I'm going to try the oral form of the B12, thinking I was doing still what the doctor had said. And it really didn't show anything. So then I went back to other doctors, you know, internists and stuff, and they tried to give me, you know, ACT. First it was prednisone, and that didn't do anything. Then they gave me ACTH, and that just made me into this crazy zombie that, you know, I'd wake up in the middle of the night either crying or laughing, or, you know, it was just horrendous. Didn't do anything for me. Then they gave me amantadine, also known as Simitrel, to try and help with my fatigue, and the doctor would have me come in every week and to evaluate, and I mean, I'd literally go in and I'd just slouch in the chair and I'd say, yeah, have the doctor come out and see me. I can't even walk back there to tell him. And so, you know, all these things, nothing was working. Eventually, I finally got on to the adenosine monophosphate and B12 injections, and they helped me. And so it was in researching those things, trying to find a common denominator, that I came up with this treatment that I currently call Procarin. And I've been on Procarin now for 8 years, and I'm totally symptom-free.
So you took what Dr. Bjork had experimented with and found to work, and you kind of took it from